What's up, horror fans? It's Anchorpete, and it is good to be back on the No, it's not the Anchorpete channel. It's the Lassercast. And whoops, what? I should know that because I'm with my good friend and co-host, Dr. ZHGOD, Danny Torkel. Danny, how you doing?
I'm doing good. I get the mix up in channels. We are all over the place. We do our Raised by Wolves talks on comic books transformed.
Right.
You have your Anchor Pete stuff going, and we do our horror and now kind of slowly shifting slightly into science fiction.
Yes.
Now here on the Lassercast. So yeah, I've been looking forward to talking about this for a while. We've been trying to get together for this video for a while.
Yeah.
Charlotte and I just rewatched. Well, I just rewatched. She watched for the first time The Terminator last night, and every time I watch that movie, I'm kind of blown away at what I'm watching, and I'm just so excited that the next movie I get to watch with her is Terminator 2.
Oh my God! Yeah, you guys are so lucky. Yeah, man. We are talking about this because we just interviewed David Weiner, who's been on the Lassercast cast a whole bunch of times, and he just released or is going to release. Right? It's not even out yet, right?
You can still go to 80s-sci-fi-doc.com up until March 27th, and you could pre-order In Search of Tomorrow, the definitive 80s sci-fi documentary, and you get everything that you got with the In Search of Darkness parts 1 and 2, which was like Blu-ray copy, posters, pins, all sorts of that stuff, and your name in the credits. You get all of that stuff, but you could order that at 80sci-fi-doc.com before March 27th. And then I think he said that they're going to start shipping in May and June, something to that effect, or April and May.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah. So there's still a chance to be a part of this. It's an awesome documentary. Danny and I got to watch all almost 5 hours of it. And that inspired these videos that we're making. For this whole month, we're doing our In Search of Tomorrow video, which just came out. We got this one today, which is about Terminator from 1984. Then we have Predator, and then we also have The Running Man. So there's an Arnold theme. Now, it's not just Terminator, though, today. You see, I thought that we could talk about androids in general and artificial intelligence. And so on the other channel, Danny and I have been talking about Raised by Wolves, which is that HBO Max show, that sci-fi show that's been on for 2 seasons now. We've really enjoyed talking about it. And there's definitely some parallels between Raised by Wolves and the Terminator. So I thought that's what we could talk about today. It's just basically androids, these robots that look like people that have no problems just brutally killing people. So with that being said, I just wanted to talk about Raised by Wolves in case people aren't familiar with that show. So basically, Raised by Wolves takes place over 100 years in the future. The Earth has been destroyed, just like it is in the Terminator, right? It's pretty much uninhabitable. But in Raised by Wolves, humanity is able to travel to another planet. They travel to Kepler 22b, and you have humanity broken into 2 factions, the Mithraic and the Atheists. And the Mithraic are people that believe in this entity called Saul. And we find out that Saul is actually kind of like a signal that, even though they kind of treat it like it's God, it's actually this signal that's sending them messages. And so in Raised by Wolves, you have a couple of different forms of artificial intelligence. Dan, you want to tell people what some of those AIs are?
Well, the main characters are mother and father, who are a pair of androids tasked with basically rescuing the atheist leftovers of humanity. They take mother is she's an android, but she's impregnated with these embryos. Only one of the children survives. They end up with more children later on, but mother and father are caregiving androids. And mother was originally a Mithraic necromancer, a super destroying robot who was retooled to be a caregiver. We also in season 2, which just ended, go watch it. It's so good. Season 2 gave us a couple of really cool new Android characters. There's this incredibly beautiful production called The Trust, which is the AI, the artificial intelligence that governs the atheistic camp. Uh, and they just follow whatever the trust says. And then later on, we have Grandmother, who is another type of kind of super android in the way Mother is, but brought back through a series of complex procedures throughout the season. The show pretty much. I mean, we've brought up comparisons with the obvious ones are with Ridley Scott's Prometheus / Aliens verse, where there's a lot of connections to the themes from Prometheus and the original Alien. But as we're going to talk about today, there's some very obvious connections that can be made between the androids in Raised by Wolves and Skynet in the Terminator franchise, or especially in the original Terminator.
That's right. Yeah. And so, first off, just speaking about the androids, the concept of the android is so interesting, right? And I think that since we're a horror channel, we should talk about how scary an android is, right? Because an android, whether it's Mother on Raised by Wolves or it's the T-800 in Terminator, obviously it looks like a real human, and everyone would believe that they were looking at a human if they didn't know that androids existed, like they don't know in Terminator, right? They know in Raised by Wolves. But you really need to have a talented actor to portray these types of beings. And boy, did they strike gold with Arnold Schwarzenegger with the Terminator. And I think that he probably has gone on to inspire the actors that portray androids up into this day, including the actress that plays Mother. I'm forgetting her name off the top of my head.
Amanda Collin?
Oh, right. Okay, she has like the kind of normal sounding name, and then some of the other female cast members looks like, what are their names? And then of course there's Abubakar Salim, who we're both huge fans of. He plays Father, and I think that just the gestures that they make to kind of show there's a robot underneath that skin. I was thinking about this, Danny, after watching both Raised by Wolves and Terminator, that even though they're playing a robot and they're a scary force that the protagonists are running away from, there is like a body horror element when you have androids.
Oh, right? I mean, I made the mistake of putting the Terminator on during dinner last night, and there's the very famous, maybe it's become infamous scene where Arnold goes back to the hotel to repair himself with the scalpel, and Charlotte kind of gave like a
I couldn't eat anymore.
I don't know if you heard in the background. She's right over there. But it was, she was like, "Oh, I don't want to watch this. Oh, I don't think I'm hungry anymore." As he's like, sticking the scalpel in his eye and you see for the first time like the inner workings of the actual machine inside of him. First in his arm, then the eye. There's a ton of body horror aspect, and of course, for those of you who have watched Raised by Wolves, this season, Grandmother is brought to life in a process that is more, I would say, is much more similar to Hellraiser. Right. The scene where Frank is born out of the blood in the attic. Right. That scene is directly influenced by Hellraiser, which is one of the great body horror films of the 80s. So there's definitely a body horror connection to the idea of cyborgs and androids, and yeah.
So what's interesting about that, there's two real interesting things about that. When something happens to a robot, whether it's in a cartoon or a live action movie, it gets a pass from the rating system because it's a robot. It's not a human. You can do all kinds of deranged things to it. Brian, who's from the Comic Books Transform channel, and I are tremendous Transformers fans. We love Transformers. And in the Transformers comics and in the cartoon movie and the live action movies, they do like horrible, despicable things to Transformers. They just like dismember them, shoot them. In Transformers, the movie from when I was a kid, one of them gets shot and like melts from the inside. So you're able to do so much when it's a robot. Now with these live action movies like the Terminator and then the show like Raised by Wolves, you can do all these kinds of horrible things to these characters, even though they look like a human, they're portrayed by a human, that I think that if you were to do it in a regular horror movie, you might be getting that NC-17 rating.
I mean, we didn't even mention the Vril, which is
right.
When you talk about body horror.
Yeah.
On Raised by Wolves, there's an android character named Vril who has her face sliced off, and so it's a human girl, but with the robotic face shining through,
right.
And it's an absolutely terrifying image that they just kept showing, and and the idea that that's a young actress playing that role. Yeah, like if that was just a female character, if that was like the daughter of, the group, you could not get away with that at all.
Yes.
Or I think HBO Max would be a lot more skeptical of the show having that be done.
Right. So I was going to ask you, Danny, then, do you know, because right behind us on our little screen is the T-800, and then there's also Mother as a necromancer, right? Do you know the genesis for either of these two, like where they got the images for those, the inspiration?
The Terminator Genesis?
Yeah. Like, do you know where James Cameron got the idea for that Terminator?
I don't know the original. Is it Metropolis?
No, so maybe the actual design is inspired by Metropolis, but for the Terminator, it's real interesting. And you probably heard this story. It's almost like an urban legend, but James Cameron, when he was on the tour for his movie Piranha, when he was at the premiere of Piranha 2, the
Spawning?
Spawning, yeah. He was in Rome, and he was sick, and he had a fever dream. And he had a fever dream that had this cybernetic figure crawling out of the flames, and it had like kitchen knives in its hands. And so that's the inspiration for the T-800. And he even said that that dream was probably inspired by Michael Myers and, John Carpenter, right? And like the idea of like Michael Myers just continuing and not stopping. So the Terminator itself, even though it obviously has very clear science fiction inspiration, it has a horror inspiration as well, Michael Myers.
Nice. Crazy. I mean, I don't know if you can see behind me, but yeah, I kind of dig Michael Myers.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you about Mother, and this actually ties into this point I was trying to make before too, which is, did you know where the inspiration for the Necromancer design comes from?
I don't. It does look a little bit like Metropolis, but
it does. So you actually live a lot closer to the thing that inspired that design. Right at Rockefeller Center, there's that atlas, right, that holds up the Earth.
Yeah.
That was the inspiration for the Necromancers. So the reason why I brought up the image point is because I think it's really interesting that they make these robots to look like humans, right? They make them in our image. They take metal and then they shape them to look like our image, right? And then they essentially put them underneath our skin. I think there's something so interesting about that. It's like they're already made in our image, but then the android takes it another step and it puts it underneath the skin, So you're like more human than human, And I just think that idea is so crazy,
I mean, especially in the first Terminator, where you don't even realize they really don't hint that Arnold is a machine until about 30 minutes into the movie, where you first see, I think it's when they run out of Tech Noir, the nightclub, and I
Right.
think that's when you first see his vision.
Right.
Yes, he gets delivered to 1984 in an electrical storm, but then so does Kyle.
Grease. Yeah.
And he punches a hole straight through the first guy, those three punks, including the late Bill Paxton. He punches a hole through the guy's chest, and you're like, okay, but Arnold looks like Arnold, so maybe this is just like some really strong guy. And at the very, very beginning of the movie, in when you see 2029, you don't see Terminators walking around. You don't see you see giant machines with laser like guns shooting, but you don't actually see, like, Terminator 2 opens with the giant Terminators just shooting at the screen, almost like you're playing the video game.
Right.
And they don't do that in the first movie. So, Charlotte wasn't even sure, because Michael Biehn, Kyle Reese, he's kind of shady for the first 20, 30 minutes. He's kind of, stalking Sarah Connor as well.
Right.
She even said, it kind of feels like I'm watching Tales from the Crypt Demon Knight, where you have these two characters who you don't really know anything about. One of them is a little shady. The other one seems to be very powerful. And you're not sure the good guy, bad guy dynamic until it's completely revealed. And then you're like, oh shit, okay, now I know what I'm dealing with.
Right.
And then at the end, you literally watch the human element of Arnold Schwarzenegger literally melt away.
Right.
Like, to the point where they linger on a like burning like skeleton,
right?
Which of course is one of the great fake out endings of all time.
Right.
Charlotte was like, he's not dead, and then you see Kyle walk through the fog, and she's like, oh, okay, good, I'm getting tired. And then all of a sudden he sits up, and she's like, what?
Yeah.
I was going to say to you, do you know what it always reminded me of? Because you probably collected Marvel cards.
Of course.
Myself as well. I'm sure Brian did as well.
Yes.
I don't know if it was the Series 1 or Series 2, but Ultron, the
Yes.
Ultron card was always the giant exoskeleton robot standing in front of the flames. And I'm 100% convinced that card was modeled on the ending of Terminator, when you first see, the skeleton in the our video now.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up Ultron, right? Because Ultron is very similar to Skynet, and it's 100%. Very similar to Mother. It's this idea that humanity creates something that's supposed to help humanity. It's supposed to be a tool. And it's interesting because whenever you see these creatures in, androids in a movie or show, they either are presented as like the caregivers, like the protectors, the helpers, like Mother seems to be, or they are the complete annihilator killing machine, right? There's like kind of no middle ground, right? And I think it's because there's no like inherent personality, which is kind of interesting too, because in Terminator 2, the T-800 starts to develop a personality, and Mother on Raised by Wolves starts to develop personality too. But there's always this idea that there's this tool that's made to better humanity, and once it has an awareness, it turns against humanity. And that happens with Ultron, like you just mentioned, and obviously Skynet. And then you have on Raised by Wolves, it's kind of crazy because the androids and stuff, they kind of change their programming left and right. But you mentioned the big AI, which is known has the Trust, and the Trust seems the most benevolent when you compare it to like Skynet or Mother. But even the Trust does things that hurt humans, and it actually almost kills a little boy on the show, right? So like whenever it's doing something that's like for the greater good always seems to be to kill people.
Well, yeah, that always comes back to the I've brought this up on our Raised by Wolves discussions. like the Asimov principle of like, that robots will never, the rule number one is you never hurt human life. But then eventually what always happens in these stories is that they realize that the biggest threat to human life are humans. And so humans have to, and that's basically what Kyle tells Sarah in the Terminator is what happened with Skynet. We invent Skynet. It's 1984. I'm assuming it has to be, there's like Cold War implications in there. Yeah. And then very quickly, Skynet, the AI, becomes self-aware and recognizes that humans are the biggest threat. And the war of the future becomes robots versus humans. Right. I wrote down a few, like just like iRobot was very similar. The Will Smith film, which is based on an Asimov story. Right. I wrote down Ultron. I wrote down Mother, but from Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien.
Oh. Okay, perfect.
And also, have you seen Ex Machina, the Alex Garland movie?
Yeah.
Another great example of like they create the Oscar Isaac, right? He creates like the most perfect AI, and then of course the AI kills one human, locks another in this unescapable building, and escapes into the modern world to probably end up taking over humanity.
Right. Yeah, that's sort of the age-old story, and it comes from old sci-fi books. And when we talk about In Search of Tomorrow, it's real interesting because like the very first part of the documentary is talking about science fiction movies prior to the 80s, where they talk about how like it's always the idea that science, if we dabble with science, it'll lead to our doom. And there's this kind of pessimistic version of science, right? Or of the future. And what David does in his documentary is he makes it look like the 80s is this optimistic, uplifting time, right? But science fiction prior to the 80s was all about the warnings. And it always seems like when you create AI, it's going to lead to our destruction. And so there are other movies in the 80s that are examples of this, but I feel like Terminator is just like the prize example. And so I thought we could kind of pivot in our discussion and we could talk about why the Terminator is so lasting, like why the Terminator movie itself is so iconic, because obviously we decided to do all these Arnold movies. This movie like solidified him as the biggest movie star, right? And there's a lot of interesting stuff from behind the scenes, but for me, I want to hear your reason, but for me, I think the reason why Terminator works so well is because it's so like everything it wants to do, it does, and there's no like fat or anything. It's just very direct. It's a very quick movie, and it's so funny because it's a movie about an efficient killing machine, and I feel like the movie itself is a fucking efficient killing machine. I feel like it just knows what it has to do, and it does it.
I'm so glad you took the words right out of my mouth, as Meatloaf would say. I noticed last night just how efficient is like the perfect word, because this movie, from the moment the tech noir scene starts everything. The tech noir is the name of the bar that Sarah Connor goes to hide out and wait for the police, where the Terminator and Kyle, the savior from the future, meet to like have their first duel, their first fight. And that's where you get the dialogue is so on point. There's not that much of it, but it's like Charlotte knew "Come with me if you want to live." She knew that was from Terminator. She had never seen the movie. I'll be back. These are iconic lines of dialogue that will come back not just in the sequels, but they'll become like linchpins of the genre. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger literally did "I'll be back," and I think it's like in his contract. Like he has to say "I'll be back." He does it as governor of California. He was like, thank you, vote for me, I'll be back. Like it became part of him as a
Right.
human being.
Right.
But yeah, the efficiency of this movie, it's just chase sequence after like hiding until you need the next chase sequence. And there's very few pauses in the action. And the pauses are not just like, okay, we need to run the dialogue, run the runtime. Like we get some great exposition about who Kyle is and why he's there, with which gives us the whole explanation of what Skynet is. Then we have the hotel scene, which is kind of important. I've made the argument the literal most important sex scene in movie history
Right.
because it's actual pivotal to the plot of the movie.
Oh,
It's not just like it's not like Friday the 13th where it's like, hey, let's get naked and have sex now. No, this is like, if we don't do this, this movie's never going to actually take place.
That's right. It's a paradox, man. You got to do it. Let's
Uh,
go. Cue
and
the soft
then
piano.
the last like half hour of the movie is just non-stop. It never lets up. It's
Right.
chase sequence. Arnold falls off the motorcycle, so he steals the gas truck. The gas truck explodes. We watch the skin melt. Well, Arnold's not in the movie anymore. That's the end. Nope. Now the robot skeleton is walking after them. They blow it up. Now it's crawling after her. It's like it doesn't fucking stop.
Right.
And
right.
it's and in that regard, there's always that debate over, people who say, well, the first Terminator is kind of like a slasher movie. Yeah, because, Jason existed. There had been, by 1984, there had been three or four Jason movies already.
Wow.
And, like, I know that you mentioned James Cameron compared, based the Terminator on Michael Myers. By 1984, we had Halloweens 1 and 2. And yeah, imagine if Michael Myers or Jason, instead of walking slowly after you, ran at top speed, jumped in whatever vehicle that was around. It is, in a way, it's a slasher horror film. I mean, he's slashing his way. Kyle says, Michael Biehn says, you can't bargain with him. There's no remorse. There's no fear. He will not stop until you're dead. I mean, that's boogeyman shit right there. So,
That's right.
what makes this movie iconic? It's all of that stuff. And then on top of it, it's the effects. It's the music. My God. Brad Fiedel, I think, is the guy who does the music. It is arguably one of the top 5 greatest scores I've ever heard, with the most iconic, one of the most iconic. And that's something that David Weiner gets into in Search of Tomorrow. One of like the sub chapters is about like the music in sci-fi in the 80s. And like you could always go to Star Trek and you could always go to Star Wars and Superman, but the Terminator music, my goodness. I mean,
Yes.
like you could just walk around and just go like dun 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 dun, and everyone knows what you mean by just those 4 beats or 5 beats.
Like
it's almost as iconic as Jaws. It really is.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went off on like the movie's so fresh in my mind, and I always forget. Terminator 2 is one of the most important movies of my life. Like, it's one of my all-time favorite movies. And because of that, I always kind of forget just how great the original is until I rewatch it.
Right.
And yeah, oh man, it's so good.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I mean, and there's actually this great part on the In Search of Tomorrow documentary where they talk about the Terminator music specifically and how they get that kind of clink noise into the soundtrack too. I'm not going to spoil it. You guys can go watch the documentary. But, I mean, yeah, a lot to say. I wanted to address the Michael Myers thing and the Jason thing. Only this time watching the movie for the first time in my life, because I've seen Terminator multiple times, when Arnold's burning, that I made that connection to like Halloween 2 when Michael burns at the end. You know?
Charlotte pointed that out even last night,
Yeah.
where we were like that. It does look like the end of Halloween. It's almost exactly like the way he falls into the fire, and like the way they focus on the mask or the face burn off. Yeah, it very, very similar to Halloween 2. You could totally see Cameron was paying some homage there.
Right. And what I think is so interesting about this movie is that like it almost is like a metaphor for the Terminator itself, right? Because like it's James Cameron at the very beginning of his career. And I think that people thought of it as one movie when they were making it. And then it kind of led to something else. Like there was something underneath it, you know, that got burned away and you see what it really is. Because like when you think about James Cameron now, you think about the movies that are under his belt, like Aliens and Terminator 2 and, The Abyss and Avatar, right? All these movies where they're just these gigantic, Titanic, right? These gigantic spectacles, and certain shots, you're like, that's a James Cameron shot. He has a very distinctive shot. His scenes always seem very blue, and there's a certain type of lighting in a lot of his shots, and you see it in this movie too. But it's just like it's being developed. It's not there yet, you know? And what's interesting is if you think about it like it was a slasher, which I think you totally could write this as a slasher, and you take that idea of he was inspired by Michael Myers, this creature kind of crawling out of the fire, and it's a robot. I feel like he took that image and he reverse engineered it, just like they took the Terminator's arm in Terminator 2 and reverse engineered that to make Cyberdyne, right, and Skynet. You take that crazy image and you're like, okay, well, how am I going to make this into a 90-minute movie of this creature walking around? Well, I have Stan Winston at my disposal, the most amazing friggin' sci-fi special effects artist out there ever, but that'll be too cost effective or not cost effective to have that throughout the whole movie, right? So we have to have it to where he can infiltrate and people will see him and not think he's a robot, because that way you can have an actor play him. So they come up with the idea of, okay, well, you have to put human skin over it so that way it can go back in time, because that's one little catch that they throw in that I always forget, which they ask Kyle Reese, they say, well, how come you don't bring back a laser gun from the future to shoot this thing? And he says, well, you have to only have living tissue or living organic matter, right? And so that's why the Terminator comes back as an infiltration unit. And, we only see the actual robot itself at the very end. And I think we're so used to seeing T2 and thinking that the robots are all over the place. But you made that good point of, we don't see it at all in the future, with the exception of that one scene. And that one scene is maybe the most horror movie part of the whole movie. When we cut to Kyle's memory of the future, and he's sitting there in the bunker, and he sees this little girl, and he has Sarah Connor's picture, and a Terminator comes in and just starts blasting everybody. He's able to get a few shots off on that Terminator, and then we get this crazy, this is a nightmare vision of like the face of this cyborg with its eyes. Man, I think that might actually be the scariest image in the whole movie.
Yeah, there's a lot of scenes like that sprinkled throughout. Just the scene in the hotel room that I talked about earlier, where some of the special effects in that scene have not aged very well. But what do you want? Like, you know what, Arnold? Can you just cut your own eye out for a good shot? Yeah, well. No problem. But like just the idea of him like taking the scalpel to the eye, and like, what are you doing? Right. Even though it's an action sequence, like whenever you see guns in a movie, you associate it as an action sequence. But him going into the police station is, how different is that scene than Malignant's police station scene? Malignant is a horror movie that came out last year, and in its most batshit crazy scene, the mysterious monster killer goes crazy and murders all the policemen in a police station. The only difference is it's stabbing them with knives which make it horror. Here you have a giant robot covered in human flesh, just shooting, getting shot, but not feeling anything. In a way, it's very Frankenstein-esque. You can even make, because it's like, you can't kill something that's not alive, or that
Right.
There's a lot of moments like that throughout that totally feel horror movie ish in the middle of this sci-fi action movie. And I'm sure you know this, because I think it got covered in Search of Tomorrow, but I had known about this for years. You know who Cameron wanted
Oh,
to
yes.
be? So Cameron wanted Lance Henriksen to be the Terminator because originally his idea was, what's scarier than just an average looking person actually being this super robot that can kill you? The studio decided they wanted a guy who looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and of course the rest is history. But
Right.
there's that probably, now the movie probably isn't as famous. No offense to Lance Henriksen, the movie's probably not as famous with him as the Terminator,
Right.
but it's probably scarier. And to that effect, Terminator 2, the bad Terminator, is the most average looking guy in the world compared to Arnold.
Right.
And there's
right.
scenes in Terminator 2 where he's beating the shit out of Arnold, and your brain is playing a game with you like, how is this skinny guy, Robert Patrick, circa 1991, beating up Arnold Schwarzenegger? And because he's just an advanced model machine. And I think there's part of me that always would have loved to. And then, of course, Lance Henriksen gets to play Bishop the android in Cameron's next big science fiction action blockbuster. So he didn't exactly get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah. There's so much interesting behind the scenes stuff of Terminator. And of course, there is that Lance Henriksen note. I don't know how accurate the Wikipedia is, but they claim that when they wanted to go get financing for the movie, they had Lance Henriksen dress up like the Terminator, and he had scratches on his face with makeup. He had a leather jacket on, and he had like gold plating for his teeth. And he kicked the door in and sat down. And then people didn't know what the hell was going on in the office for the producers. And so that was how James Cameron kind of pitched it to them. Other people that they considered for the Terminator were Mel Gibson and also Stallone. According to the Wikipedia, they thought about having O.J. Simpson play the Terminator, and James Cameron didn't think that people believe he was a killer.
Yeah, that's the story.
Yeah. But Arnold himself has said when he was being interviewed around the time, he thought of the movie that it was going to be like a B movie, or that it wasn't going to be a big hit. He referred to it as like a shit movie when they were just starting out, before they started filming and stuff. But then when he started to see the footage that James Cameron had shot, then he was like, oh no, this is going to be something big. And then of course it just became this big, huge.
It's really also, just from a Schwarzenegger standpoint, it's kind of crazy because he was still working to get his English down, obviously. The movies he had made before this were not big time successful movies. I think Pumping Iron, the documentary, was probably the most big time film that he had been in up until that point.
He was in Conan too.
Oh, he wasn't. This is after Conan?
Yeah.
Okay. So, because even in Conan, though, this movie really, if you're already Conan, and to then become this near silent stalker killer bad guy, it's you running the risk. He doesn't have, at this point in his career, he doesn't have 10 other notable hero movies. So when Denzel Washington decides to do Training Day, he has an entire career of being the great good guy. So it's, he's playing off character. Right. If you look at the next 5 years, only 5 years of Schwarzenegger's career, he's just basically good guy, action hero, action hero, action hero. And to think that that came off the bat of this performance, you know, instead of being cast as like just a continual silent villain for the rest of the decade, it's really interesting that like a year later he's doing Commando, which is a borderline action comedy with all the one-liners in it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Arnold obviously has had his impact on sci-fi, and I think it is really interesting that you say that you know he could have been marked as the villain. I think because he says less than 100 words in the whole fucking movie. You know, I think it's just because he's so larger than life that they couldn't really think of another kind of silent killer that could be the Terminator, right? Like, what other, like, you know, steal the show kind of villain do you have in sci-fi movies? You know, maybe you have Darth Vader, but obviously he talks a lot. But like, it's just they had to make him a hero because he's so big in this role. You know, it's just so iconic. And so, you know, obviously he kind of redeems himself and becomes the hero even in Terminator 2. You know, he's a good version of the T-800. And he's kind of reprogrammed just like Mother is reprogrammed. That's another thing that kind of ties in. I wanted to throw that in there too. Another comparison between Raised by Wolves and Terminator is that you have these killing machine, or at least Mother's a killing machine, and they reprogram her to protect humans. And another thing that is a connection between the two is the futuristic world, like the Earth itself. Like, the Earth in Raised by Wolves looks like the Earth in Terminator, you know? But
and it's only 2029, which is 7 years from now.
yeah. But I think, was it like 1997 is when Skynet...
August 29th, 1997.
There we go, yeah. So I think I was like 14 or something. Maybe I'm a little off. 96.
15.
I was 15, thank you. Yeah. But just unless you had some other things, I was just kind of gonna wrap it up. You good?
Yeah.
So you were talking about how Arnold's the hero, and Arnold's the hero in our next two movies. And one point I wanted to make finally was, I think that 80s sci-fi, you need Arnold. You need that strong leading man, and he comes in this movie like a force to be reckoned with. No one can stop him. You know, ironically, he's stopped by a young woman, right? Is taken out, right, by you know, the future heroines, right? Sarah Connor. But you need that Arnold presence to kind of make the hero that sci-fi movies of the 80s have. And in the 80s, you have these incredible villains with this technology, the amazing special effects. And so you need that leading man that you know can take them on. And so for our next video, we're going to take on one of the very great you know, villains of the 80s, sci-fi villains, the Predator. So I'm super pumped about that one.
Yeah. The Predator is another movie where, I mean, it's a horror movie, a science fiction movie, and an action movie all at the same time. And, you know, you could argue one over the other, and you're always going to be right. And yeah, I can't wait to talk about that because it gives me a chance to rewatch Predator, because who doesn't want to rewatch Predator?
Oh my God, I love it so much. I kind of want to watch all of these with my little girl too. On a little side note, I actually didn't get to watch Terminator. I think I maybe was older than your daughter, but I would always see the end. One of the things about my mom is she would let me see these movies, but she would only show me the parts that she thought were like kind of cool or that a kid would like. And she wouldn't show me the scary horror parts of the one sex scene in Terminator, which is funny because when you go to watch Terminator, there's that one meme where it's like what Terminator's like when I'm watching it. And it's like, you know, Arnold shooting at people. And then it's like what Terminator's like when my mom walks in, and it's that scene, you know?
So, real quick story. So I remember 9 years old seeing the previews for Terminator 2 on TV. And I remember telling my parents, I have to see this movie. This movie looks so good. I was so excited. And my dad was like, okay, but you have to see the first one. And I was, there's a first one? And we rented it from the video store. And I sat on the couch in between my parents. And we watched The Terminator. And good movie, fun, action, gore, great. The sex scene happens. And it was the first time in my life that I ever remember feeling so awkward. Like, Danny Danny learned what the word awkward meant while watching the Terminator on the couch in between my parents.
Yes.
And I was like, and I just remember going like, can we fast forward? Like
Yep.
I don't want to watch this with you guys. And
Yes.
then like I remember my dad getting so excited watching the end of this movie with like, where he just keeps coming back over and over again, like the unstoppable. They blow him up and parts of him come after you. And and then Terminator 2 was the first movie I ever saw multiple times in the movie theater. I saw it 3 times in the theater, and I wore out the VHS tape that I had. So yeah, so excited to rewatch that coming up soon.
Yeah. Danny's innocence was lost, just like that blanket that was in between Linda Hamilton and Michael Bihn's hand. Just whoop, right at the very end there. Yeah, and that's the thing is my mom, like, she didn't show me any of the previous stuff, but at the very end, that scene where it's like crawling after Linda Hamilton, and she's like, "You're terminated, fucker," and she pushes the button. Oh, so good, so good. And that, of course, leads to like first big like female. Well, you already had Ripley, but like one of the first big sci-fi female heroines too. So maybe eventually we'll start talking about Ripley too. But of course, you can't talk about Terminator and not mention Sarah Connor.
Of course.
So
I mean, we'll probably talk about Ripley sometime in late April, around April 26th, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe that might be a big deal for us. Yeah, cool, man. Well, until Predator time, this has been me and Danny, and we thank you guys for watching. If you haven't watched our Raised by Wolves videos, go on over to Comic Books Transformed and check out our reviews for all the episodes of season 2. And Danny, I will see you this weekend to talk about Predator.
You got